Cool. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Strong Talk. It's been a while since we did one of these, unfortunately, but we're glad to be getting it started again. And this week, we're going to be talking about designing places for people of all ages, and specifically designing places that we know will be accessible to seniors. So we're going to start with Sara Joy is one of our guests today. Sara Joy Proppe is a Strong Towns member and contributor. She works by day as a project manager in real estate development in the Twin Cities. And in her free time, she's developing Proximity Project to educate and activate churches to be stewards of the built environment. We also have as a guest today, Melissa Stanton. She is the editor and advisor for AARP's Livable Communities Initiative, which supports the efforts of towns and neighborhoods and cities and rural areas to become great places for people of all ages. And she's previously written for Time Magazine, The Atlantic, New York Times, and many other publications, and is author of 2 books. So Sara Joy and Melissa, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So Sara Joy, I wanted to start with you because this conversation was kind of triggered by a piece that you wrote. You had originally wrote it for a website called Humane Pursuits and then give us permission to republish it on our site. And it was called The Isolation of Aging in an Auto-Oriented Place. And when I read it, I thought it was lovely and meaningful, but I didn't really anticipate how widely it was going to be read and shared after we publish it on our site. I think it was definitely the most read piece of that week and probably in the top pieces that we published for our entire month of April. Can you summarize that article for people who haven't read it? And then I'm curious if you have an idea about why do you think it was so popular and resonated with so many people?
Yeah, I will say I, like you, was very surprised at how much traction it got. It's not something that I expected in any way, but it was exciting to see. So in short, the article more or less was a personal story of something that I experienced a few months ago here in the Twin Cities where I live. I was driving home one night from the store, and as I had gone out of the store to my car in the parking lot, I had noticed this elderly woman pushing her shopping cart, kind of what seemed like into this abyss of nowhere because it was late at night, it was dark, and there weren't really any cars that I could tell that she was going towards. And so it struck me as strange, but I thought, well, I don't know what's going on, whatever, and went and got in my car. And then probably a few hundred yards later, when I was leaving, she had stopped and she was kind of waving me down. And so I pulled over and asked what she needed, and she asked me for a ride home. And I asked her, well, how are you planning to get home? Because I was kind of surprised. It seemed a little bit risky.
Yeah, just wait for a ride.
Flagging somebody down. And she told me that she'd been planning to take the bus, but it was complicated and it had gotten later. And I definitely understand that, just kind of in knowing the area. It's quite a long ways to the bus stop from the grocery store through, as I mentioned, a very dark abandoned parking lot. So that was one component. And then she added to me at the end, she said, and it's just so much nicer to have somebody to talk to. And that comment really pulled at my heartstrings and just reminded me of some of the isolation that I think people feel, and particularly seniors in our communities, as they're maneuvering this built environment alone in many ways, and what that looks like for them and how they feel isolated physically because of just the difficulty of maneuvering the built environment, but then how that contributes to this element of social isolation too. And so I gladly put her in my car with her groceries and gave her a ride to her house. And so that's kind of what the article talked about. I also highlighted the work of a woman here at the University of Minnesota who does some research on aging in place and the built environment. And she had published, or there'd been an article published in the Star Tribune recently that highlighted her work that talked about some of the what she called the micro features of the landscape that are really, that really affect the senior population in terms of curb height and sit benches and things like that, that really can affect whether or not they're able to actually get out and walk around in their communities. And so I talked a bit about that as well. So that's a short or synopsis of the article. And, like I said, I was surprised too at how much traction it got. And for me, I really think what it helped I think some of that traction comes from just the personal story side of it.
Yeah.
People are really drawn to, these personal connections that we have and the ways that we experience the built environment together and how they can personally impact us. And, for me, that was also one of the things that really triggered me wanting to write it is I thought, I read a lot of stuff about aging in place and, the things that contribute to the quality of that. But I personally don't, engage in that all that much, or I don't have a lot of personal stories. But here I had this moment with this woman that it just made it very real to me, the challenges of senior population in our cities. Mm-hmm. So it was a good way to share that and highlight it.
Yeah, I also think that probably some of the reason that this topic that so many people connect with is either, they are seniors who are reading it or they've experienced those challenges, or at least like they have a parent, grandparent, friends, aunts, uncles, whatever, who has experienced this. It's something that's pretty close to home for a lot of us, I think.
Definitely. I would say even my parents, they're 72 now and they're both very agile still. And so they walk around, no problem. They drive everything. But I do often think about what does the next 10 years look like, as that gets harder for them and they live in an area that is not walkable. And, if they eventually cannot drive, what does that mean for their getting around town, for their social life, for just, being a part of community? What does that look like?
Yeah. Melissa, I want to bring you in here too, because we shared some of your work on the Strong Towns website earlier this year as well. You put together a really nice slideshow of some of the features that Sara Joy just referenced in her article, and so many of the ways that our street design can exclude and isolate seniors. You showed us images of sidewalks that suddenly end, and bus stops in dangerous locations, intersections with no safe way to cross. What was the inspiration for putting together that slideshow?
That particular slideshow, which is called Dangerously Incomplete Streets, was created to accompany the Dangerous by Design report, the 2014 Dangerous by Design report that the National Complete Streets Coalition publishes every 2 years. And they're looking at, metropolitan areas, urban areas, and kind of ranking what are the most, dangerous places to be a pedestrian. So what we try to do with our slideshow is not just talk about livability issues, but show what we're talking about. And unfortunately, it wasn't hard to find a lot of examples of dangerously incomplete streets. So let me back up just a little bit to explain complete streets, if any of the viewers don't know what that term means. Complete streets is a concept that says that whenever a roadway is built, instead of it just being built for vehicular traffic, the designer should be thinking, who else needs to use this space, use this road? Is this in an area where people might be walking alongside it? If so, then we need sidewalks. Is it in an area that people would need to cross the street? Then yes, we need traffic lights and we need crosswalks. In the past, and most of our roadways in the United States right now were really built just to move cars. And if you look back in history, of course, roadways were built for everybody before we had cars. People were on horses, people were on bicycles, people were walking. And somehow transportation planners just, their priority and their goal was moving as many vehicles as quickly as possible. And when that happened, roads became unwalkable. So the complete streets concept is saying to communities, establish a policy that if you are building a new road, you at least consider the other users. It's not saying that every road has to be suitable for everybody. We're not gonna, nobody would argue that a interstate highway should have sidewalks or be crossable. And the policy also holds that if a road is being renovated for some reason, that's a time also to go in and say, hey, what have been the problems? Maybe we should have a crosswalk here or a sidewalk. So wanting to illustrate what this report was talking about, I went on websites, I found pictures, and a lot of the pictures in the slideshow are just from my own community.
Oh, okay.
And I live in a fairly rural community between Washington, D.C. and Annapolis, Maryland. And, just in one place, I could fill an entire slideshow with roadways that don't have sidewalks, shopping areas that you just cannot get from, one to the one next to it or across from it. We have pictures from the National Complete Streets Coalition that shows, people walking to school, kids walking to school on roads with no sidewalks.
Yeah.
So I work for AARP, which is now just called AARP. It was founded in the 1950s as the American Association of Retired Persons. We don't stand for that anymore. But our demographic and who we advocate for are, older adults, people 50 plus, to recognize what the needs are of people 50 plus. And that is a big, range of people. A lot of 50-year-olds still have little kids at home,
right.
But it will include, our parents, our grandparents. And what we are trying to say with the initiative, the Livable Communities Initiative, is that, aging is different now. Our population, I think it's by 2030, 1/5 of the U.S. population will be age 65 or older. So that's 20% of the population will be not even just 50 and above, it's 50 above. That's 65 above. So there's an even larger proportion of the population that's going to be 50 plus. And we're saying, unlike in the past, when older people kind of, almost disappeared to Florida or the Sun Belt and lived in retirement, and that was kind of the ideal of what retirement meant. People don't want to do that anymore. They want to stay in their communities. And Sara mentioned aging in place. That anybody shouldn't have to leave the town or city, neighborhood, even street they love, because they've gotten older. So when we talk about livable communities, and sometimes when we're talking about the importance of walkability and, bicycling, some people who are AARP members might say, I'm not going for, I want to get in my car. I'm not going for a walk. I'm not riding a bicycle. And what we're saying is, if a community is built with the ability of people to do those things, it makes it better for everybody. So we're not just working to make communities safer, more livable for older people, but, if you make a street safe for, an active 80-year-old to be able to cross, that street is also going to be safe for an 8-year-old or, a parent pushing a stroller. And that's what we're trying to get across, that even if you individually will never get on a bicycle, having a dedicated bike lane actually makes everybody else safer too.
Definitely.
It makes the car, the automobile drivers safer, it makes the pedestrians safer. And what I would encourage people who are watching this is to look around where they are. And when you start to pay attention to how the sidewalks in your area work, or the streets are laid out, or if, like in Sara's article, you were a person who didn't have a car, or you missed the last bus, could you walk? Or would you, that woman would have really been stranded in that empty parking lot.
Yeah, carrying her heavy groceries. Yeah, I often like to do a mental exercise for myself when I'm walking, or especially crossing a street, where I say, like, would I feel safe walking here with my 96-year-old grandma? And also, would I feel safe walking here with my 1-year-old niece? I think that's a very helpful thing. I mean, there are places where I don't feel safe as myself, an able-bodied young person. So I think you're absolutely right that when we make places that are safe for seniors, it has ripple effects for everybody.
Yeah. And I would say even expanding that definition of safe, because I think so often we think of that only in terms of traffic interactions and cars and things like that. And I think even the quality of sidewalks, are they well kept in terms of, are they even, or are there a bunch of cracks? Is there kind of a bunch of quote unquote potholes going on in the sidewalk, that make things unsafe? And I think that gets easily looked over and kind of at the bigger infrastructure problems, which, we need to be looking at both. So I would encourage people to expand that definition of what safe means too.
Yeah, that's a great point.
In many communities, safety really truly means safety. Can I go out of my home and not be robbed?
True.
Or,
yeah.
Not be harassed? And one of the things that has happened is because we have developed communities where people, if they are out, are often isolated in their own cars. It almost makes communities more dangerous because the rare person who might be actually going for a walk is more isolated.
Right.
And I don't know the saying exactly, but more people on the streets or more eyes on the street. And,
yeah, definitely.
I recently was in Japan, and in Japan, and I had lived there many years ago, and this time around, now that I am a mother, I was noticing so many little children just walking home from school by themselves. And these are, pretty, in the city. It's a congested city. There aren't always sidewalks. So sometimes, I wouldn't think it was so safe for kids to be walking, but they actually don't have a concern about safety in terms of crime or even so much the pedestrian safety. There were a lot of, really big crosswalks and, flashing signs and pedestrian areas. But
strength in numbers, it sounds like.
It was a strength in numbers, and it was also that, well, why should we be concerned that something will happen to our children? There are all these other people around to help keep an eye on them. And I'm from New York City originally, and I know the stereotype had always been, oh, New York is so dangerous, so dangerous. And I never really felt afraid in New York, but I have felt afraid in some of these more sprawling cities, Los Angeles or parts of Miami at some point, where, people don't get out of their cars. And so that's another thing that we forget about, walkability, that even if you yourself are not going to walk to the grocery store, other people will, and there'll just be, other life going on outside of the buildings.
Definitely. Sara Joy, I want to ask you about your work with the Proximity Project, working with faith communities and churches. I wonder if you see any intersections with that and this issue of seniors. Obviously, most churches are pretty intergenerational and have a lot of seniors attending. Is that something that you think would apply?
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I always encourage churches that I speak at to do kind of the first step. I say, go to WalkScore and type in the address of your church and see what kind of score you get. And then actually go out and walk that area, because some of those walkable places are not actually all that walkable when you encounter the physical infrastructure and the quality of the sidewalks or the length of the, intersections, things like that. And again, same thing that you all have said, think about it in terms of if you were walking with a 96-year-old grandmother, or if you had a toddler with you, things like that. So that's kind of one of the first things that I encourage. And then I also, encourage them too, as they assess that, then, if they encounter places where there is, improvements that could be made, then how do they advocate for that in the community? How do they, you know, go to their city council member and make these suggestions, or get involved with the neighborhood association to really be advocates for improving these areas and this walkability in their communities? And then too, just with their own property, you know, can you put in a sit wall? Can you put in some benches along the property line there that, you know, gives people a place to stop and rest as needed and things like that. And, you know, even within their own property, kind of where have you situated parking versus pedestrian walkways? And does it make it obviously accessible for somebody coming by foot? And is there a clear path that's safe and comfortable, you know, for that person? So those are some things that I encourage, you know. And there's a verse in the Bible that speaks to redemption, including old men and women sitting in the streets.
Nice.
And I always pull that in and say, you know, what would that look like? Could we do that today? Probably not. So I think that that's something we should be striving for, because, you know, and to me, that's a place of dignity, really, for people to be able to sit safely in the streets and be in the streets. And unfortunately, we've taken that away and have not given that dignity to being in the street. It's a scary place to be these days. So how do we bring it back to that vision? So those are some of the things that I talk about.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you guys have both brought up also of course we have the far end of like safety. Are you going to be hit by a car? But then there's so much in the middle that's about like comfort, you know, tripping on a crack in the sidewalk, or even just like having benches. We just ran an article on our site a couple weeks ago about how parks could be more friendly and welcoming to seniors by like having more benches and shade, drinking fountains, bathrooms, like things that are just help create a place that people would want to spend time in, and that is welcoming to people of all ages.
Definitely.
Yeah. To Sarah's point about how do you, you know, get these changes made, and how do you, you know, articulate and stress to a city council member, let's say, you know, what a need is. One of the resources we have on our website is a walk audit toolkit, which has been designed just for anybody, a regular person, you know, print it out, download it, print it out. And what we are encouraging people to do is to take it, pick a street, you know, maybe there's an intersection that is especially problematic, and it walks them through exercises and how to record and document what is going on. So things such as what Sarah mentioned, you know, the timing of the lights. So could somebody really cross that street? Is there enough time before the light changes?
Right.
And, you know, we ask people to spend some time, you know, and it can take, you know, 15 minutes even. It doesn't have to be an incredibly complicated undertaking. And when you could go in with that kind of documentation and say, hey, you know, I visited this place at these times. It is impossible to cross this street. A solution would be, you know, make the light longer, or something like that. We had a community in Austin, South Austin, Texas, where there is a senior center, and there was a bus stop near the senior center. So sounds perfect. Except where the bus let the people off, there was no traffic light and no way to cross the street. So literally had, you know, people 65 and older, or, you know, maybe 55 and older at that place, dodging traffic to get to a building that was created for their use. And what the local AARP chapter down there in AARP state office did is they filmed it, and they, you know, documented it using a walk audit toolkit, and took it to the city council person and said, look at this, you know, this makes no sense. Here you have the transit, which we all talk about, you know, people need to have another option to get around. Here you have the building that is encouraging people to get together and you know, encourage activity. yet this tiny little piece, but essential piece, was missing.
Right.
And they were able to do that. They brought the council person out, saw it, and then money was provided to install a pedestrian and I'm sorry, I forgot the word.
Maybe a crossing signal or something.
Right, that, it's green, cars can move until the pedestrian shows up and needs to cross that street. And my mother lives in a 55 and older community in Maryland. Same thing. They built a 55 and older community, and the shopping is right nearby, but you can't cross that street. So people are driving quarter of a mile.
Yeah, and probably some of those people eventually aren't going to be able to drive either.
Right.
So then
they won't be able to drive. And that little quarter of a mile walk would be so good for their health.
Right.
And, it's an activity, would get them out of the house. So she's been working with the local transportation department to, get a crosswalk in there. But what is so complicated, and as you know, is it a state road? Is it a county road? Is it a private road? And it would just be so nice if all of these things were thought of in advance, rather than citizens having to, after the fact, advocate and retrofit. But the Walk Audit Toolkit is available at aarp.org/livable.
I'll include the link at the end.
You know what?
Sure.
Now it's aarp.org/walk audit. I'm sorry. And there are two toolkits.
Cool.
One is just that an individual can print it out and do it themselves or gather some neighbors. The other toolkit is if you wanted to organize kind of a workshop where you brought community leaders like a city council person and some neighbors, and everybody did this activity together. And so, it would go to the place that is the problem and then come back and show them, here, these are different solutions. And I think that's, from your website and my website and so many others who are doing what we do, we're trying to show the solutions. That, hopefully people will see them and be inspired to advocate for them in their own communities.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good tool. And I think the pervading theme of this conversation to me is just these are such simple little things that would make a really big difference for people of all ages, especially seniors. So thank you guys so much.
Even the benches that Sara has talked about. That is, that is so helpful to anybody, even somebody who is walking with a toddler. Or having to tie their own shoe, a bench is really important.
Great.
And that's something, benches are something that people can do in their own front yards.
Right, definitely.
And I have one in my front yard. Nobody sits in it, but I have it there. And,
nice.
Just for people who are walking in the neighborhood.
Great. Well, Sara Joy and Melissa, thank you so much for being on the show and for your interest in covering these issues. And I hope you guys keep writing and thinking about this stuff, and we'll keep sharing your work. I really appreciate you guys and appreciate all the work that you do. So
thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks.